A Movable Feast, Hemingway, Part 2. The Fall Spring. When spring came, even the fall spring, there were no problems except where to be happiest. The only thing that could spoil a day was people, and if you could keep from making engagements, each day had no limits. People were always the limiters of happiness except for the very few that were as good as spring itself. In the spring mornings, I would work early while my wife still slept. The windows were wide open and the cobbles of the street were drying after the rain. The sun was drying with the wet faces of the houses that faced the window. The shops were still shuttered. The goatherd came up the street blowing his pipes, and a woman who lived on the floor above us came onto the sidewalk with a big pot. The goatherd chose the one with the heavy-bagged black milk goats and milked her into the pot, while his dog pushed the others onto the sidewalk. The goats looked around, turning their necks like sightseers. The goatherd took the money from the woman and thanked her, and went on up the street piping, and the dog herded the goats on ahead, their horns bobbing. I went back to writing, and the woman came up the stairs with the goat milk. She wore her felt-soled cleaning shoes, and I only heard her breathing as she stopped on the stairs outside our door, and then the shutting of a door. She was the only customer for goat milk in our building. I decided to go down and buy morning racing paper. There was no quarter too poor to have at least one copy of a racing paper, but you had to buy it early on a day like this. I found one in the Rue de Gaff at the corner of the Place Contrescarpe. The goats were going down the Rue de Gaff, and I breathed the air in and walked back fast to climb the stairs and get my work done. I had been tempted to stay out and follow the goats down the morning street. But before I started work again, I looked at the paper. They were running at Einheim, a small, pretty and lost in his track that was the home of the outsider. So that day after I finished work, we would go racing. Some money had come from the Toronto paper that I did newspaper work for, and we wanted a long shot if we could find one. My wife had a horse one time at Auteuil named Chèvre d'Or that was 120-1 and leading by 20 lengths when he fell at last jump with enough savings on him to keep us 6 months. We tried never to think of that. We were ahead on the year until Chèvre d'Or. Do we have enough money to really bet, Tatty? My wife asked. No, we just figure to spend what we take. Is there something else you'd rather spend for? Well, she said, I know, it's been terribly hard and I've been tight and mean about money. No, she said, but I knew how severe I've been and how bad things had been. The one who's doing his work and getting satisfaction from it is not the one that poverty bothers. I thought of bathtubs and showers and toilets that flushed at things that inferior people to us had, or that you enjoyed when you made trips, which we often made. There was always the public bathroom down at the foot of the street by the river. My wife never complained once about these things, any more than she cried about Chèvre d'Or when he fell. She'd cried for the horse, I remembered, but not for the money. I'd been stupid when she needed a grey lamp jacket, and had loved it once she had bought it. I'd been stupid about other things too. It was all part of the fight against poverty. You never win except by not spending, especially if you buy pictures instead of clothes. But then we did not think ever of ourselves as poor. We did not accept it. We thought we were superior people, and other people that we looked down on and rightly mistrusted were rich. It never had seemed strange to me to wear sweatshirts for underwear to keep warm. It only seemed odd to the rich. We ate well and cheaply, and drank well and cheaply, and slept well and warm together and loved each other. I think we ought to go, my wife said. We haven't been for such a long time. We'll take a lunch and some wine. I'll make good sandwiches. We go on the train and it's cheap that way, but let's not go if you don't think we should. Anything we do today would be fun. It's a wonderful day. I think we should go. You wouldn't rather spend it some other way? No, she said arrogantly. She had the lovely high cheekbones for arrogance. Who are we anyway? So we went by the train from the Gare du Nord through the dirtiest and saddest part of town and walked from the siding to the oasis of the track. It was early and we sat on my raincoat on the fresh cropped grass bank and had our lunch and drank from the wine bottle and looked at the old grandstand, the brown wooden betting booths, the green of the track, the darker green of the hurdles, and the brown shine of the water jumps, and the whitewashed stone walls, and the white posts and rails, the paddock under the new leaf trees, and the first horses being walked to the paddock. We drank more wine and studied the form in the paper, and my wife lay down the raincoat to sleep with the sun on her face. I went over and found someone I knew from the old days at San Siro in Milano. He gave me 2 horses. Mind, they're no investment, but don't let the prize put you off. We won the first with half of the money that we had to spend, and we paid 12-1, jumping beautifully, taking command of the far side of the course and coming in 4 lengths ahead. We saved half the money and put it away and bet the other on the second horse who broke ahead, led all the way over the hurdles and on the flat, just lasted to finish line with the favourite gaining on him with every jump and the 2 whips flailing. We went to have a glass of champagne at the bar under the stand and wait for the prices to go up. My, but racing is very hard on people, my wife said. Did you see the horse come up on him? I can feel it inside me. What will you pay? The cut was 18-1, but they may have bet him at last. The horses came by, eyes wet, with his nostrils working wide to breathe, the jockey patting him. Poor him, my wife said. We just bet. We watched them go on by and had another glass of champagne, and then the winning prize came up to 85. That meant he'd pay 85 francs for 10. They must have put a lot of money on at the end, I said. But we had paid plenty of money, big money for us, and now we had spring and money too. I thought that was all we needed. A day like that one, if we split the winnings 1/4 for each to spend, left a half a racing capital. I kept the racing capital secret and apart from all other capital. Another day later that year, when we had come back from one of our voyages and had good luck at some track, again we stopped at Pugny on the way home, going to sit at the bar after looking at the clearly prized wonders in the window. We'd oysters and crabes mexicaines with glasses of Sancerre. We walked back through the Tuileries in the dark and stood and looked across the Arc de Carrousel, up across the dark gardens with the lights of the Concorde behind the formal darkness, and then the long rise of lights towards the Arc de Triomphe. Then we looked back towards the dark of the Louvre, and I said, Do you really think that the 3 arches are in line? These stood in the Sermione in Milano. I don't know, Tati, they say so and they ought to know. Do you remember when we came out in the spring on the Italian side of the Saint Bernard after the climb in the snow? And you and Chink and I walked down all day in the spring to Aosta. Chink ordered across the Saint Bernard in street shoes. Remember your shoes? Do you remember us having fruit cup at Biffy's in the gallery with Capri and fresh peaches and the wild strawberries and a tall glass pitcher with ice? That time was what made me wonder about the 3 arches. I remember the Sermion. It's like this arch. Do you remember the inn at Eagle, where you and Chink sat in the garden that day and read while I fished? Yes, Tati. I remember the Rhône, narrow and grey, full of snow water, and the 2 trout streams on either side, a Storkopper and the Rhône Canal. The Storkopper was really clear that day and the Rhône Canal was still murky. Do you remember when the horse chestnut trees were in bloom, and how I tried to remember a story that Jim Gamble, I think, had told me about a wisteria vine and I couldn't remember it? Yes, Tati, and you and Chink always talked about how to make things true, writing them, and put them rightly and not describe. I remember everything. Sometimes it was right and sometimes you were right. I remember the lights and textures and the shapes you argued about. Now I would come over the gateway through the Louvre and cross the street outside and was standing on the bridge leaning on the stone and looking down at the river. We all 3 argued about everything and always specific things, and we made fun of each other. I remember everything we ever did, and everything we ever said on the whole trip. Hadley said, I really do. About everything. When you and Chink talked, I was included. It wasn't like being a wife at Miss Stein's. I wish I could remember the story about the wisteria vine. It wasn't important, it was a vine that was important, Tati. Do you remember I brought some wine from Eagle home to the chalet? They sold it to us at the inn. They said it should go with the trout. We brought it wrapped in the copies of La Gazette de Lausanne, I think. The Sion one was even better. Do you remember how Mrs. Ganswish cooked the trout au bleu when we got back to the chalet? There was such wonderful trout, Tatty, and we drank the Sion wine and ate out on the porch with the mountainside dropping off below, and we could look across the lake and see the Dent de Midi, with the snow half down it, and the trees at the mouth of the Rhône where it flowed into the lake. We always missed Chink in the winter and in the spring. Always, and I miss him now when it's gone. Chink was a professional soldier and had gone out to Mons from Sandhurst. I had met him first in Italy, and he'd been my best friend and then our best friend for a very long time. He spent his leaves with us then. He's going to try to get leave this next spring. He wrote last week from Cologne. I know, we should live in this time now and have every minute of it. We're watching the water now as it hits this buttress. Look what we can see when we look up the river. We looked, and there it all was. Our river and our city, and the island our city. We're too lucky, she said. I hope Chink will come. He takes care of us. He doesn't think so. Of course not. He thinks we explore together. We do, but it depends on what you explore. We walked across this bridge, and we're on our own side of the river. Are you hungry again? I said, us talking and walking. Of course, Tatty, aren't you? Let's go to a wonderful place and have a truly grand dinner. Where? Michaud's. That's perfect and so close. So we walked up the Rue de Saint-Père to the corner of Rue Jacob, stopping and looking in the windows at pictures and the furniture. We stood outside of Michaud's restaurant reading the post-it menu. Michaud's was crowded, and we waited for people to come out, watching the tables where people already had their coffee. We're hungry again from walking, and Michaud's was an exciting and expensive restaurant for us. It was where Joyce ate with his family then. He and his wife against the wall, Joyce peering at the menu through his thick glasses, holding the menu in one hand. Nora by him, a hearty but delicate eater. Giorgio, thin, foppish, sleek-headed from the back. Lucia, with heavy curly hair. A girl not quite yet grown, all of them talking Italian. Standing there, I wondered how much of what we had felt on the bridge was just hunger. I asked my wife and she said, I don't know, Tatty. There's so many sorts of hunger. In the spring there are more, but that's gone now. Memory's hunger. I was being stupid, and looking in the window and seeing two tornado being served, I knew I was hungry in a simple way. You said we were lucky today, of course we were, but we had very good advice and information. She laughed. I didn't mean about racing. You were such a literal boy. I meant lucky other ways. I don't think Chink cares for racing, I said, compounding my stupidity. No, he'd only care for it if we were riding. Don't you want to go racing any more? Of course, and now we can go whenever we want again. But you really want to go? Of course you do, don't you? It was a wonderful meal at Michaud's after we got in, but when we finished there was no question of hunger anymore. The feeling that had been like hunger when we were on the bridge was still there when we caught the bus home. It was there when we came in the room and after we'd gone to bed and made love in the dark. It was there. When I woke with the windows open and the moonlight and the roofs and the tall houses, it was there. I put my face away from the moonlight into the shadow, but I could not sleep and lay awake thinking about it. We'd both wakened twice in the night, and my wife slept sweetly now with moonlight on her face. I had to try to think it out, and I was too stupid. Love had seemed so simple that morning, when I had wakened and found the full spring and heard the pipes of the man with the herd of goats, and gone out and bought the racing paper. But Paris was a very old city, and we were young and nothing was simple there, not even poverty, nor sudden money, nor the moonlight, nor right and wrong, nor the breathing of someone who lay beside you in the moonlight. End of a vacation. We went racing together many more times the year and other years after I had worked in the early mornings, and Hadley enjoyed it and sometimes she loved it. But it was not the climbs the high mountain meadows above the last forest, nor nights coming home to the chalet, nor was it climbing with Chink, our best friend, over a high pass into the new country. It was not really racing either, it was gambling on horses, but we call it racing. Racing never came between us, only people could do that, but for a long time it stayed close to us like a demanding friend. It was a generous way of thinking of it. I, the one who was so righteous about people and their destructiveness, tolerated this friend and was the falsest, most beautiful, most exciting, vicious and demanding, because she could be profitable. To make it profitable was more than a full-time job, and I had no time for that. But I justified it to myself because I wrote it, even though in the end, when everything I'd written was lost, there was only one racing story that survived because it was out in the mails. I was going to races alone more now, and I was involved in them and getting too mixed up with them. I worked 2 tracks in the seasons when I could, Auteuil and Enghien. It took full-time work to try to handicap intelligently, and you could make no money that way. It was just how it worked out on paper. You could buy a newspaper and gave you that. You had to watch jumping race in the top of the stands at Auteuil, and it was a fast climb up to see what each horse did, and see the horse that might have won and did not, and see why or maybe how he did not do what he could have done. You watched the prizes and all the shifts of odds each time a horse you were following would start, and you had to know how he was working and finally get to know when the stable would try with him. He always might be beaten when he tried, but you should know by then what his chances were. It was hard work, but at Auteuil it was beautiful to watch each day they raced, and you could be there and see the honest races with the great horses, and you got to know the course as well as any place you had ever known. You knew many people finally, jockeys and trainers and owners, and too many horses and too many things. In principle, I only bet when I had a horse to bet on, but I sometimes found horses that nobody believed in except the men who trained and rode them, that won the race after race, with me betting on them. I stopped finally because it took too much time. I was getting too involved and I knew too much about what went on in Enghien and at the flat racing tracks too. When I stopped working on the races, I was glad, but it left an emptiness. By then I knew that everything good and bad left an emptiness when it stopped. But if it was bad, the emptiness filled up by itself. If it was good, you could only fill it by finding something better. I put the racing capital back into the general funds and I felt relaxed and good. The day I gave up racing, I went over to the other side of the river and met my friend Mike Ward at the travel desk and Guaranteed Trust, which was then at the corner of the Rue d'Italia on the Boulevard d'Italia. I was depositing the racing capital, but I did not tell that to anyone. I didn't put it in the checkbook, though I still kept it in my head. Want to go to lunch? I asked Mike. Sure, kid. Yeah, I can do that. What's the matter? Aren't you going to the track? No. We'd lunch at the Square Louvois, at a very good plain bistro with wonderful white wine. Across the square was the Bibliothèque Nationale. You never went to the track much, Mike, I said. No, not for quite a long time. Why did you lay off it? I don't know, Mike said. Yeah, sure I do. Anything you have to bet on and get a kick isn't worth seeing. Don't you ever go out? Sometimes to see a big race, one with great horses. We spread pâté on the good bistro bread and drank the white wine. Did you follow them a lot, Mike? Oh, yes. What do you see that's better? Bicycle racing. Really? You don't have to bet on it, you'll see. A track takes a lot of time. Too much time. It takes all your time. I don't like the people. I was very interested. Sure. You make it all right. All right. Good thing to stop, Mike said. I've stopped. Hard to do. Listen, kid, we'll go to the bike races sometimes. It was a new and fine thing that I knew little about, but we did not start it right way. That came later. It came to be a big part of our lives later, when the first part of Paris was broken up. But for a long time it was enough just to be back in our part of Paris and away from the track and to better our own life and work, and on the painters that you knew, and not try to make your living gambling and call it by some other name. I've started many stories about bicycle racing, but I've never written one that is as good as its races are both in the indoor and outdoor tracks and on the roads. But I will get to the Vélodrome d'hiver, with the smoky light of the afternoon and the high-banked wooden track, and the whirring sound of the tires made on the wood as the riders passed, the effort of the tactics as the riders climbed and plunged, each one a part of his machine. I'll get the magic of the demi-fond, the noise of the motors with the rollers set out behind them that the entraîneur rode, wearing their heavy crash helmets and leaning backward in the ponderous leather suits, to the shout of the riders who followed them from the air resistance, the riders in the lighter crash helmets bent low over the handlebars and their legs, turning the huge gear sprockets, and the small front wheels touching the roller behind the machine that gave them shelter to ride in, and the duels that were more exciting than anything, the put-putting of the motorcycles and the riders elbow to elbow and wheel to wheel, up and down and around at deadly speed, until one man couldn't hold the pace and broke away in the solid wall of air, and that he had been sheltered against hit him. There were so many kinds of racing. The straight sprints raced in heats or in matches races, where the two riders would balance for long seconds on the machines for the advantage of making the other rider take the lead, and then the slow circling and the final plunge into the driving purity of speed. There were the programs, the team races for 2 hours, the series of pure sprints in the heats to fill the afternoon, the lonely absolute speed events of one man racing an hour against the clock, the terribly dangerous and beautiful races of 100 kilometers on the big banked wooden 500-meter bowl of Stade Buffalo, the outdoor stadium at Montrouge, where they raced behind big motorcycles, Linard, the great Belgian champion that they called the Sioux, for his profile dropping his head to suck up cherry brandy from a rubber tube that connected with a hot water bottle under his racing shirt when he needed it towards the end, as he increased his savage speed, and the championships of France between big motors of the 660-meter cement track of the Parc de Prince near Auteuil, the wickedest track of all, where we saw the great rider Gagné fall and heard his skull crumple after the crash helmet as you crack and hard-boiled egg against a stone to peel it on a picnic. I must write the strange world of the 6-day races and the marvels of the road racing in the mountains. French is the only language that has ever been written in properly, and the terms are all French, and that is what makes it hard to write. Mike was right about it. There's no need to bet, but that comes at another time in Paris. Hunger was good discipline. You got very hungry when you did not eat enough in Paris because all the bakery shops had such good things in the windows and people ate outside of tables on the sidewalk so that you saw and smelled the food. When you had given up journalism and were writing nothing that anyone in America would buy, explaining at home that you were lunching out with someone, the best place to go was the Luxembourg Gardens, where you saw and smelled nothing to eat all the way from the Place de l'Observatoire to the Rue de Vaugirard. There you could always go into the Luxembourg Museum, and all the paintings were sharpened and clearer and more beautiful when you were belly empty, hollow hungry. I learned to understand Cézanne much better and to see truly how he made landscapes when I was hungry. I used to wonder if he was hungry too when he painted, but I thought possibly it was only that he had forgotten to eat. It was one of those unsound but illuminating thoughts you have when you have been sleepless or hungry. Later I thought Cézanne was probably hungry in a different way. After you came out of the Luxembourg, you could walk down the narrow Rue Ferraud to the Place Saint-Sulpice, and there was still no restaurants, only the quiet square with its benches and trees. There was a fountain with lions, and pigeons walked on the pavement and perched on the statues of the bishops. There was a church, and there were shops selling religious objects and vestments on the north side of the square. From this square you could not go further towards the river without passing shops selling fruits, vegetables, wines, or bakery and pastry shops. But by choosing your way carefully, you could work to your right round the grey and white stone church and reach the Rue de l'Odéon, and turn up to your right towards Sylvia Beach's bookshop, and on your way you did not pass too many places where things to eat were sold. The Rue de l'Odéon was bare of eating places until you reached the square, where there were 3 restaurants. By the time you reached 12 Rue de l'Odéon, your hunger was contained, but all your perceptions were heightened again. The photographs looked different, and you saw books that you'd never seen before. "You're too thin, Hemingway," Sylvia would say. "Are you eating enough?" "Sure." "What did you eat for lunch?" My stomach would turn over and I would say, "I'm going home for lunch now." At 3 o'clock? I didn't know it was that late. Adrienne said the other night she wanted to have you and Hadley for dinner. Would ask for Fogg. You like Fogg, don't you? Or Lubar. You like him. I know you like him. Or anyone you really like. Will you speak to Hadley? I know she'd love to come. Alzenera, no. Don't you work too hard now that you don't eat properly. I won't. Get home now before it's too late for lunch. They'll save it. Don't eat cold food either. Eat a good hot lunch. Did I have any mail? I don't think so, but let me look. She looked and found a note and looked up happily and then opened a closed door in a desk. This came while I was out, she said. It was a letter and it felt as though it had money in it. Wetterkop, Sylvia said. It must be from Der Kirschnitt. Did you see Wetterkop? No, but it was here with George. He'll see you, don't worry. Perhaps he wanted to pay you first. It's 600 francs. He said there'll be more. I'm awfully glad you reminded me to look, dear Mr. Awfully Nice. It's damned funny that Germany's the only place I can sell anything, Tim and the Frankfurter Zeitung. Isn't it? But don't you worry ever. You can sell stories to Ford, she teased me. 30 francs a page, say one story every 3 months in the transatlantic. Story 5 pages long make 150 francs a quarter, 600 francs a year. But Hemingway, don't worry about what they'll ring now. The point is that you can write them. I know, I can write them, but nobody will buy them. There is no money coming in since I quit journalism. They will sell. Look, you have the money for one right there. I'm sorry, Sylvia, forgive me for speaking about it. Forgive you for what? Always talk about it, or about anything. Don't you know all writers ever talk about is their troubles? But promise me you don't worry, and that you eat enough. I promise. Then get home now and have lunch. Outside in the Rue de l'Odéon, I was disgusted with myself for having complained about things. I was doing what I did of my own free will, and I was doing it stupidly. I should have bought a large piece of bread and eaten it instead of skipping a meal. I could taste the brown, lovely crust, but it is dry in your mouth without something to drink. You goddamn complainer, you dirty, phony Saint Mathieu, I said to myself. You quit journalism of your own accord. You have credit and Sylvia would have loaned you money. She's plenty of times, sure, and then the next thing you would be compromising on something else. Hunger's healthy and the pictures do look better when you're hungry. Eating is wonderful too, and do you know where you're going to eat right now? Lips is where you're going to eat and drink too. It was a quick walk to Lips, and every place I passed that my stomach noticed quickly as my eyes and nose made the walk an added pleasure. There were few people in the brasserie, and I was sat on the bench against a wall with a mirror in the back and a table in front. The waiter asked if I wanted beer, and I asked for distingué. The big glass mug that held a liter and the potato salad. The beer was very cold and wonderful to drink. The pommes à huile were firm and marinated in the olive oil delicious. I ground black pepper over the potatoes and moistened the bread in the olive oil. After the first heavy draught of beer, I drank and ate very slowly. When the pommes à huile were gone, I ordered another serving in the cervelas. It was a sausage like heavy white frankfurter split in two and covered with a special mustard sauce. I mopped up all the oil and all of the sauce with bread and drank the beer slowly until it began to lose its coldness, and then I finished it and ordered a demi and watched it drawn. It seemed colder than the distingué, and I drank half of it. I'd not been worrying, I thought. I knew the stories were good and someone would publish them finally at home. When I stopped doing newspaper work, I was sure that the stories were going to be published. But every one I sent out came back. What made me so confident was Edward O'Brien's taking my Old Man story with the best short stories book and then dedicating the book for that year to me. Then I laughed and drank some more beer. The story had never been published in a magazine, and he'd broken all his rules to take it for the book. I laughed again, and the waiter glanced at me. It was funny because, after all, he'd spelled the name wrong. It was one of the 2 stories I'd left when everything I'd written was stolen in Hadley's suitcase, that time at the Gare de Lyon, when she was bringing the manuscripts down to me to Lausanne as a surprise, so I could work on them on our holidays in the mountains. She'd put in the originals, the typescripts, and the carbons, all in manila folders. The only reason I had the one story was that Lincoln Steffens had sent it out to some editor who'd sent it back. It was in the mail while everything else was stolen. The other story that I had was the one called Up in Michigan, written before Miss Stein had come to our flat. I'd never had it copied because she said it was inaccrochable, and it had been in a drawer somewhere. So after we'd left Lausanne and gone down to Italy, I showed the racing story to O'Brien, a gentle, shy man, pale with pale blue eyes and straight lanky hair he cut himself, who lived then as a boarder of the monastery up above Raplow. It was a bad time and didn't think I could write any more then, and I showed my story to him as a curiosity, as you might show stupidly the binnacle of a ship when you'd lost in some incredible way, or as you might pick up your buttered food and make some joke about it as been amputated after a crash. Then when he read the story, I saw him was hurt far more than I was. I'd never seen anyone hurt by a thing other than death or unbearable suffering except Hadley when she told me about the things being gone. She'd cried and could not tell me. I told her that no matter what, the dreadful thing was that had happened, nothing could be too bad. Whatever it was all right and not to worry. We'd work it out. Then finally she told me. I was sure she could not have brought the carbons too, and I hired someone to cover for me on my newspaper job. I was making good money then at journalism, and took the train for Paris. It was true all right, and remember what I did in the night after I let myself into the flat and found it was true. That was over now, and Chink had taught me never to discuss casualties, so I told O'Brien not to feel so bad. It was probably good for me to lose early work, and I told him all the stuff you feed the troops. I was going to start writing stories again, I said, and as I said it, only trying to lie so that he would not feel so bad, I knew that it was true. Then I started to think in libs about when I had first been able to write a story after losing everything. It was up in Cortina d'Ampezzo, when I had come back to join Hadley there after the spring skiing, which I had to interrupt to go on assignment to the Rhineland and to the Roy. It was a very simple story called Out of Season, and I admitted the real end of it, which was that the old man hanged himself. This was omitted in my new theory that you could omit anything if you knew that you omitted, and the omitted part would strengthen the story and make people feel something more than they understood. Well, I thought, now, I have them so they do not understand them. There cannot be so much doubt about that. There is most certainly no demand for them, but they will understand the same way as they always do in painting. It only takes time, and it only needs confidence. It is necessary to handle yourself better when you have to cut down on food, so you will not get too much hunger thinking. Hunger is good discipline, and you learn from it. And as long as they do not understand it, you are ahead of them. Oh sure, I thought, I'm so far ahead of them now that I can't afford to eat regularly. It would not be bad if they caught up a little. I knew I must write a novel, but it seemed an impossible thing to do when I had been trying with great difficulty to write paragraphs that would be distillation of what made a novel. It was necessary to write long stories now as you would train for a longer race. When I had written a novel before, the one that had been lost in the back stall in Gare de Lyon, I still had the lyric facility of boyhood that was as perishable and as deceptive as youth was. I knew it was probably a good thing that it was lost, but I knew, too, that I must write a new novel. I would put it off, though, until I could not help doing it. I was damned if I would only write one because it was what I should do if we were to eat regularly. When I had to write it, then would be the only thing to do, and there was no choice. Let the pressure build. In the meantime, I would be writing a long story about whatever I knew best. By this time I had paid the cheque and gone out and turned to the right and crossed the Rue de Rennes so that I would not go to the Doulmaker for a coffee. I was walking up the Rue Bonaparte on the shortest way home. What did I know best that I had not written about and lost? What did I know about truly and care for the most? There was no choice at all. There was only the choice of streets to take you back fastest to where you worked. I went to Bonaparte to Dieu-Mer, then the Rue d'Assas, and then the Rue Notre-Dame-des-Champs, and the Clos des Lilas. I sat in the corner with the afternoon light coming in over my shoulder and wrote in the notebook. The waiter bought me a café crème, and I drank half of it when it cooled and left it on the table while I wrote. When I stopped writing, I did not want to leave the river, where I could see the trout in the pool, its surface pushing and swelling smooth against the resistance of the log-driven piles of the bridge. The story was about coming back from the war, but there was no mention of the war in it. But in the morning the river would be there, and I must make it in the country, and all that would happen. There were days ahead to be doing it, that each day. No other thing mattered. In my pocket was the money from Germany, so there was no problem. When that was gone, some other money would come in. All I must do now was to stay sound and good in my head until morning, when I would start to work again. Fernand Dauphin and Devil's Disciple. The Clos des Lilas was the nearest good café when we lived in a flat over the sawmill at 113 Rue Notre-Dame-des-Champs, and it was one of the best cafés in Paris. It was warm inside in the winter, and in spring and fall it was very fine outside the tables under the shade of the trees on the side where the statue Michel Ney was, and the square regular tables under the big awnings along the boulevard. Two of the waiters were good friends. People from the Dôme and the Rotonde never came to the Lilas. There was no one there they knew, and no one would have stared at them if they came. In those days many people went to the café at the corner of the Boulevard Montparnasse and the Boulevard Raspail. To be seen publicly in a way such places anticipated the columnist as the daily substitutes for immortality. The Clos de Lilas had once been a café where poets met more or less regularly, and the last principal poet had been Beaufort, whom I had never read. But the only poet I ever saw there was Blaise Sardin, and his broken boxer's face and his pined-up, empty-sleeve rolling a cigarette with his run-good hand. He was a good companion until he drank too much, and at that time when he was lying, it was more interesting than many men telling a story truly. But he was the only poet who came to the Lilas then, and I only saw him there once. Most of the clients were elderly bearded men in well-worn clothes who came with the wives of the mistresses and wore and did not wear thin red Legion of Honor ribbons in their lapels. We thought of them all hopefully a scientist or savant, and they sat almost as long over an apéritif than the men in shabbier clothes who sat with their wives or mistresses over café crème and wore the purple ribbon at the palms of the academy, which had nothing to do with the French Academy and meant we thought that they were professors or instructors. These people made it a comfortable café, since they were all interested in each other in their drinks or coffees, or infusions, or in the papers and periodicals, which were fastened to rods, and no one was on exhibition. There were other people too who lived in the quarter and came to the Lilas, and some of them wore Croix de Guerre ribbon in the lapels, and others also had the yellow and green of the médaille militaire, and I watched how well they were overcoming the handicap of the loss of limbs, and saw the quality of their artificial eyes and the degree of skill with which their faces had been reconstructed. There was always an almost iridescent, shiny cast about the considerably reconstructed face, rather like that of a well-packed ski run, and we respected these clients more than we did the savants or professors, although the latter might well have done their military service too without experiencing mutilation. In those days we did not trust anyone who had not been in the war, but we did not completely trust anyone, and there was a strong feeling that the syndicat might well be a little less flashy about his vanished arm. I was glad he had been in the Lilas early in the afternoon before the regular clients had arrived. On this evening I was sitting at the table outside the Lilas, watching the light change of the trees and the buildings of the passage of the great, slow horses of the outer boulevard. The door of the café opened behind me to the right, and a man came out and walked to my table. "Oh, here you are," he said. It was Ford Maddox Ford, as he called himself then, and was breathing heavily through a heavy stained moustache, and holding himself as upright as an ambulatory, well-clothed, up-ended hogshead. "May I sit with you?" he asked, sitting down, and his eyes, which were a washed-out blue under colourless lids and eyebrows, looked out at the boulevard. "I spent good years of my life that those beasts should be slaughtered humanely," he said. "You told me," I said. "I don't think so. I'm quite sure. Very odd. I've never told anyone in my life. Will you have a drink?" The waiter stood there, and Ford told him that he would have a chambre cassée. The waiter was tall and thin and bald on the top of his head, with the hair slicked over, and who wore a heavy old-style dragoon moustache, repeated the order. "No, make it a fin de loup," Ford said. "A fin de loup for monsieur?" The waiter confirmed the order. I'd always avoided looking at Ford when I could, and I always held my breath when I was near him in a closed room, but there was the open air and the fallen leaves blew along the sidewalks from a side of the table past his, so I took a good look at him, repented, and looked across the boulevard. The light was changed again, and I'd missed the change. I took a drink to see if his coming had fouled it, but it tasted very good. "You're very glum," he said. "No." "Yes, you are. You need to get out more. I stopped by to ask you to the little evenings we were giving at the amusing bal musette near the Place Contescar de Rue Cardinal Lemoine. I lived above it for 2 years before you came to Paris this last time." "How odd. Are you sure?" "Yes," I said, "I'm sure. The man who owned it had a taxi, and when I had to get a plane, he'd take me out to the field, and we'd stop at the zinc bar of the Bal and drink a glass of wine in the dark before we start for the airfield." "I've never cared for flying," Ford said. "You and your wife plan to come to the Bal Musette Saturday night. It's quite gay. I'll draw you a map so you can find it. I stumbled on it quite by chance." "It's under 74 Rue Cardinal Lemoine," I said. "I lived on the 3rd floor." "There's no number," Ford said, "but you'll be able to find it if you can find the Place Contescar." I took another long drink. The waiter had brought Ford's drink, and Ford was correcting him. "It wasn't a brandy and soda," he said hopefully, but severely. "I ordered a Chambry, vermouth, and cassis." "It's all right, Jean," I said. I'll take the fin. Oui, monsieur, what he orders now. What I ordered, corrected Ford. At that moment, a rather gaunt man wearing a cape passed on the sidewalk. He was with a tall woman, and he glanced at our table, and then away and went on his way down the boulevard. Did you see me cut him? Ford said. Did you see me cut him? No. Who did you cut? Belloc, Ford said. Did I cut him? I didn't see it, I said. Why did you cut him? For every good reason in the world, Ford said. Did I cut him, though? He was thoroughly and completely happy. I'd never seen Belloc, and I didn't believe he had seen us. He looked like a man who had been thinking of something and had glanced at the table almost automatically. I felt badly that Ford had been rude to him, as being a young man who was commencing his education, I had a high regard for him as an older writer. This is not understandable now, but in those days was a common occurrence. I thought it would have been pleasant if Belloc had stopped at the table and might have met him. The afternoon I'd been spoiled by seeing Ford, but I thought Belloc might have made it better. What are you drinking brandy for? Ford asked me. Don't you know it's fatal for a young writer to start drinking brandy? I don't drink it very often, I said. I was trying to remember what Ezra Pound told me about Ford, that I must never be rude to him, and that I must remember that he only lied when he was very tired, that he was a really good writer, and that he'd been through very bad domestic troubles. I tried hard to think of these things, but the heavy, wheezing, ignoble presence of Ford himself, only touching distance away, made it difficult, but I tried. Tell me why one cuts people, I asked. Until then I'd thought it was something only done in novels by Reader. I'd never been able to read a novel by Reader, not even at some skiing plays in Switzerland where reading matter had run out when the wet south wind had come and there was only the left-behind Toschnitz's editions of Before the War. But I was sure by some sixth sense that people cut one another in the novels. A gentleman, Ford explained, will always cut a cat. I took a quick drink of brandy. Would he cut a bounder? I asked. It would be impossible for a gentleman to know a bounder. You only cut someone you know on terms of equality, pursued. Naturally. How would one ever meet a cad? You might not know it, or the fellow could have become a cad. What is a cad? I asked. Isn't he someone that one has to thrash within an inch of his life? Not necessarily, Ford said. Is Ezra a gentleman? I asked. Of course not, Ford said. He's an American. Can't an American be a gentleman? Purpose John Quinn, Ford explained. Certain of the ambassadors. Myron T. Herrick, possibly. Was Henry James a gentleman? Very nearly. Are you a gentleman? Naturally. I've held His Majesty's commission. It's very complicated, I said. Am I a gentleman? Absolutely not, Ford said. Then why are you drinking with me? I'm drinking with you as a promising young writer. As a fellow writer, in fact. Good of you, I said. You might be considered a gentleman in Italy, Ford said, magnanimously. But I'm not a cad. Of course not, dear boy. Who ever said such a thing? I might become one, I said sadly, drinking brandy and all. That was what did for Lord Harry Hotspur and Trollope. Tell me, was Trollope a gentleman? Of course not. You sure? There might be two opinions, but not in mine. Was Fielding? He was a judge. Technically, perhaps. Marlowe? Of course not. John Donne? He was a parson. It's fascinating, I said. I'm glad you're interested, Ford said. I'll have a brandy and water with you before I go. After Ford left, it was dark, and I walked over to the kiosk and bought a Paris Sport Complet, the final edition of the afternoon racing paper with the results of Auteuil, and the line of the next day's meeting in Anaheim. The waiter Emile, who had replaced Jean on duty, came to the table to see the results of the last race at Auteuil. A great friend of mine, who rarely came to the Lila, came over to the table and sat down. And just then, as my friend was ordering a drink from Emile, a gaunt man in the cape with a tall woman passed us on the sidewalk. His glance drifted toward the table and then away. That's Hilary Belloc, I said to my friend. Ford was here this afternoon and cut him dead. Don't be silly, Ours, my friend said. That's Lester Crowley, the diabolist. He's supposed to be the wickedest man in the world. Sorry, I said. Birth of a New School. The blue-backed notebooks, the 2 pencils and the pencil sharpener, a pocket knife was too wasteful. The marble-topped tables, the smell of early morning, sweeping out and mopping, and luck were all you needed. For luck you carried a horse chestnut and a rabbit's foot in your right pocket. The fur had been worn off the rabbit's foot long ago, and the bones and the sinews were polished by wear. The claws scratched in the lining of the pocket, and you know your luck was still there. Some days it went so well that you could make the country so that you could walk into it through the timber to come out into the clearing and work up onto the high ground and see the hills beyond the arm of the lake. A pencil lead might break off in the conical nose of the pencil sharpener, and you would use a small blade of the pen knife to clear it up, or else sharpen the pencil carefully with a sharp blade and then slip your arm through the sweat-salted leather of your pack strap to lift the pack again. Get the other arm through and feel the weight settle on your back and feel the pine needles under your moccasins as you started down for the lake. Then you would hear someone say, "Hi, Hem. What are you trying to do? Write in a Gaffy." Your luck had run out, and you shut the notebook. This was the worst thing that could happen. If you could keep your temper, it would be better, but it was no good at keeping mine. Then said, "You rotten son of a bitch, what are you doing here when you're filthy beat? Don't be insulting just because you want to act like an eccentric. Take your dirty camping mouth out of here. It's a public cafe. I've just as much right here as you have. Why don't you go up to Petit Chaumier where you belong?" Oh dear, don't be so tiresome. Now we could get out and hope it was an accidental visit and that the visitor had only come in by chance and there was not going to be an infestation. There were other good cafés to work in, but they were a long walk away, and there was my home café. I was about to be driven out of the Clos de Lila. I had to make a stand or move. It was probably wiser to move, but the anger started to come, and I said, "Listen, a bitch like you has plenty of places to go. Why do you have to come here and louse a decent café?" "I've come in just to have a drink. What's wrong with that?" "At home they'd serve you and break the glass." "Where's home? It sounds like a charming place." He was sitting at the next table, a tall, fat young man with spectacles. He'd ordered a beer. I thought I would ignore him and see if I could write. So I ignored him and wrote 2 sentences. All I did was speak to you. I went on and wrote another sentence. It dies hard when it is really going and you're into it. "I suppose you've gotten so great nobody can speak to you." I wrote another sentence that ended the paragraph and read it over. It was still all right, and I wrote the first 2 sentences of the next paragraph. "You never think about anyone else or that they may have problems too." I'd heard complaining all my life. I found I could go on writing, and that was no worse than other noises, certainly better than Urza learning to play the bassoon. "I suppose you want to become a writer and felt it in every part of your body, and it just wouldn't come. I went on writing and was beginning to have luck now, as was the other thing. Suppose once it had come like an irresistible torrent, and then it left you mute in silence. Better than mute and noisy, I thought, and went on writing. It was in full cry now, and the unbelievable sentences were soothing as the noise of a plank being violated in the sawmill. "He went to Greece," I heard him say later. I had not heard him for some time except as noise. I was ahead now, and I could leave it and go on tomorrow. "You say you used it, or you went there." "Don't be vulgar," he said. "Don't you want me to tell you the rest?" "No," I said. I closed the notebook and put it in my pocket. "Don't you care how it came out?" "No." "Don't you care about life and the suffering of a fellow human being?" "Not you. You beastly." "Yes. I thought you'd help me, him. I'd be glad to shoot you." "Would you?" "No, there's law against it. I'd do anything for you." "Would you?" "Of course I would. Then keep the hell away from this cafe. Start with that." I stood up and the waiter came over and I paid. "Can I walk down the sawmill with you, him?" "No." "Will I see you some other time?" "Not here." "That's perfectly right," he said. "I promised." "What are you writing?" I made a mistake and asked. "I'm writing the best I can, just as you, but it's so terribly difficult. You shouldn't write if you can't write." "What do you have to cry about it for? Go home, get a job, hang yourself. Only don't talk about it. You could never write." "Why do you say that? Did you ever hear yourself talk? It's writing I'm talking about." "Then shut up." "You're just cruel," he said. "Everybody always said you were cruel and heartless, conceited. I was defended to you, but not anymore." "Good. How can you be so cruel to a fellow human being?" "I don't know," I said. "Look, if you can't write, why don't you learn to write criticism?" "Do you think I should?" "It would be fine," I told him. "Then you can always write. You won't ever have to worry about it not coming, nor being mute and silent. People will read it and respect it." "Do you think I could be a good critic?" "I don't know how good, but you could be a critic. There will always be people who help you, and you can help your own people. What do you mean by my own people? The ones you go around with. Oh, them. They have their critics. You don't have to criticize books, I said. There's pictures, plays, ballet, there's cinema. You make it sound fascinating, Hem. Thank you so much. It's so exciting, it's creative too. Creation's probably overrated. After all, God made the world in only 6 days and rested on the 7th. Of course, there's nothing to prevent me from doing creative writing too. Not a thing, except you may set yourself impossibly high standards by criticism. They'll be high, you can count on that. I'm sure they will. He was a critic already, so I asked him if he would have a drink, and he accepted. Hem, he said. And I knew he was a critic now since, in conversation, they put your name in the beginning of a sentence rather than at the end. I have to tell you that I find your work just a little too stark. Too bad, I said. Hem, it's too stripped, too lean. Bad luck. Hem, too stark, too stripped, too lean, too sinewy. I felt the rabbit's foot in my pocket guiltily. I'll try to fasten it up a little. Mind, I don't want it obese. Hell, I said, practicing speaking like a critic. I'll avoid it as long as I can see. Glad we see eye to eye, he said manfully. You remember about not coming here when I'm working? Naturally, Hem, of course. I'll have my own cafe now. You're very kind. I try to be, he said. It would be interesting and instructive the young man had turned out to be a famous critic, but it did not turn out that way, although I had high hopes for a while. I did not think that we'd come back the next day, but I did not want to take chances, and I decided to give the Clos a day's rest. So the next morning I woke early, boiled the rubber nipples and the bottles, made the formula, finished the bottling, gave Mr. Bumpy a bottle, and worked on the dining room table before anyone but he, F. Puss the cat, and I were awake. The two of them were quiet and good company, and I worked better than I had ever done. In those days you did not really need anything, not even the rabbit's foot, but it was good to feel it in your pocket. With Passin at the Dome. It was a lovely evening, and I had to work hard all day and left the flat over the sawmill and walked out through the courtyard with the stacked lumber, closed the doors, crossed the street, and went into the back door of the bakery that fronted on the Boulevard Montparnasse, and out through the good bread smells of the ovens in the shop to the street. The lights were on in the bakery, and outside it was the end of the day, and I walked in the early dusk up the street and stopped outside the Terrace de Nigue, the Toulouse restaurant, where our red and white checkered napkins with the wooden napkin rings in the napkin rack waiting for us to come to dinner. I read the menu mimeographed in the purple ink and saw the plat du jour was cassoulet. It made me hungry to read the name. Mr. Lavigne, the proprietor, asked me how my work had gone, and I had said it gone very well. He said he'd seen me working on the terrace of the Clos de Lilla early in the morning, but he'd not spoken to me because I was occupied. You have the air of a man alone in the jungle, he said. I'm like a blind pig when I work. But you were not in the jungle, monsieur. In the bush, I said. I went up on the street, looking in the windows and happy with the spring evening and people coming past. In the three principal cafés I saw people I knew by sight and others that I knew to speak to. But there were always much nicer looking people that I did not know. In the evening, with the lights just coming on, were hurrying to some place to drink together, to eat together, and then to make love. Now people in the principal café might do the same thing, or they might just sit and drink and talk in love, to be seen by others. The people that I like and not met went to the big café because they were so lost in them, and no one noticed them, and they could be alone in them and be together. The big café was cheap then too, and all had good beer, and the apéritif cost reasonable prices that were clearly marked on the saucer that were served with them. On this evening I was thinking those wholesome but not original thoughts and feeling extraordinarily virtuous because I'd worked well and hard on a day when I wanted to go out to the races very badly. But at this time I could not afford to go to the races, even though there was money to be made, though if you worked at it. It was before the days of saliva tests and other methods of detecting artificially encouraged horses, and doping was very extensively practiced. But handicapping beasts that are receiving stimulants and detecting the symptoms at the paddock and acting on your perceptions, which sometimes bordered on the extrasensory, then backing them with money you cannot afford to lose, is not the way for a young man to sporting a wife and child to get ahead in the full-time job of learning to write prose. By any standards we're still very poor, and I still made such small economies as saying that I'd been asked out for lunch and then spending 2 hours walking in the Luxembourg Gardens and coming back to describe the marvellous lunch to my wife. When you're 25 and you're natural heavyweight, missing a meal makes you very hungry. But it also sharpens all your perceptions, and I found that many people I wrote about had very strong appetites and a great taste and desire for food. Most of them were looking forward to having a drink. At the Nigue de Toulouse, we drank the good Garot wine from the quarter, the half, or the full carafe, usually diluting it about 1/3 with water. At home over the sawmill, we had a Corsican wine that had great authority and a low price. It was a very Corsican wine and you could dilute it by half with water and still receive its message. In Paris, then, you could live very well on almost nothing, and by skipping meals occasionally and never buying any new clothes, you could save and have luxuries. Coming back from the select now, we had sheared off at the sight of Harold Stearns, who I knew would want to talk to horses, those animals I was thinking of righteously and light-heartedly as beasts, and I just forsworn. Full of my evening virtue past the collection of inmates at the Rotonde, and scorning vice and the collective instincts, crossed the boulevard to the Dôme. The Dôme was crowded too, but there were people there who worked hard. There were models who had worked, and there were painters who had worked until the light had gone better, and there were writers who had finished a day's work for better or worse, and there were drinkers and characters, some of whom I knew, and some that were only decoration. I went over and sat at the table with Passine and 2 models who were sisters. Passine had waved at me while I had stood on the sidewalk on the Rue d'Alhambra side, wondering whether to stop and have a drink or not. Passine was a very good painter and was drunk, steady, purposefully drunk and making good sense. The 2 models were young and pretty. One was very dark, small, beautifully built, with a falsely fragile depravity. The other was childlike and dull, but very pretty in a perishable, childish way. She was not very well built as a sister, but neither was anyone else that spring. The good and the bad sisters, Passine said. I had money. What would you drink? Une demi-blonde, I said to the waiter. Have a whiskey, I have money. I like beer. If you really liked beer, you would be at Lips. I suppose you've been working. Yes, it goes. I hope so. Good. I'm glad. And everything still tastes good. Yes. How old are you? 25. Do you want to bang her? He looked towards the dark sister and smiled. She needs it. You probably banged her enough today. She smiled at me with her lips open. He's wicked, she said. But he's nice. You can take her over to the studio. Don't make piggishness, the blonde sister said. Who spoke to you? Passine asked her. Nobody, but I said it. Let's be comfortable, Passine said. A serious young writer and the friendly, wise old painter, the 2 beautiful young girls with all of life before them. We sat then, the girls sipped the drinks, and Passine drank another fin de loup, and I drank the beer. But no one was comfortable except Passine. The dark girl was restless, and she sat on display, turning her profile and letting the light strike the concave planes of her face, showing me her breasts under the hold of the black sweater. Her hair was cropped short and was sleek and dark as the Orientals. You've posed all day, Passine said to her. Do you have to model that sweater now at the Gaff? It pleases me, she said. You look like a Japanese toy, he said. Not the eyes, she said. It's more complicated than that. You look like a poor perverted little puppy. Perhaps, she said, but alive. That's more than you. We'll see about that. Good, she said. I like proofs. You didn't have any today. Oh, that, she said, and turned to catch the last evening light on her face. You were just excited about your work. He's in love with canvases, she said to me. There's always some kind of dirtiness. You want me to paint you and pay you and bang you to keep my head clear and be in love with you too, Passine said. You poor little doll. You like me, don't you, monsieur? She asked me. Very much. But you're too big, she said sadly. Everyone's the same size in bed. It's not true, her sister said, and I'm tired of this talk. Look, Passine said, if you think I'm in love with canvases, I'll paint you tomorrow in watercolours. When do we eat? Her sister asked, and where? Will you eat with us? The dark girl asked. No, I go to eat with my légitime. That was what they said then. Now they say my régulier. You have to go. Have to and want to. Go on then, Passine said, and don't fall in love with typewriting paper. If I do, I'll write with a pencil. Watercolours tomorrow, he said. All right, my children. I will drink another and then we eat where you wish. Chez Viking, the dark girl said. Me too, his sister urged. All right, Passine agreed. Good night, jeune homme. Sleep well. You too. They You keep me awake, he said. I never sleep. Sleep tonight. At the Chez le Viking, he grinned with his hat on the back of his head. He looked more like a Broadway character of the 90s than the lovely painter that he was. And afterwards, when he hanged himself, I like to remember as he was that night at the Dom. They say the seeds of what we'll do are in all of us, but it always seemed to me that in those who make jokes in life, the seeds are covered with better soil and with a higher grade of manure.